Karen Kwiatkowski is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
I want to talk to you about a number of different things here for our 9/11 kind of 10-year retrospective. Since retiring, you've become a pretty noted harsh critic of the U.S. government's involvement in Iraq and the misinformation propaganda campaign that took place as far as intelligence goes. We spoke a little bit with former Republican Congressman Bob Ney about information he received, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, having been looking at it from the military as opposed to from Congress. When did you first realize certain aspects of this misinformation campaign were ramping up? How did you react? What are your thoughts now, having a little bit more time to look back upon it?
Yeah, well, in May of 2002, almost a year before the invasion of Iraq, I transferred from one part of OSD plans into another part. And the part that I transferred into was Near East South Asia, which has responsibility for Middle East policy. At the time, early May 2002, I was very surprised to discover that the invasion plan for Iraq had already been approved and was on its second review at the top levels of OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense. So we hadn't even begun in mainstream United States. The media had not yet really ramped up the propaganda campaign, which of course emanated in large part from the Pentagon and from Dick Cheney's office, from the executive level. We hadn't begun to talk the people into war, and yet we were already finalizing in many ways this invasion plan. I thought that was kind of strange. And then of course, by the end of the summer and throughout the fall, the propaganda that I was seeing in the New York Times, on CNN, on Fox News, anywhere that government people were speaking about what was going on, I noticed that two things. One, much of what they were saying was not supported by intelligence that we were seeing. And the second thing was many of the phraseology, the catchphrases, the terms that were being repeated by members of the administration to the public were the same catchphrases that we were also seeing propagandized to us from the Office of Special Plans, which happened to be a sister organization to where I worked. And they provided us with talking points. And apparently they were also providing many people in media and around Washington with those same talking points. Now, when we got them, they were marked classified secret. But when I read them in the New York Times, apparently they were cleared. So
let's break that apart, because there's so many interesting things in there. Congressman Bob Ney, former Congressman Bob Ney, pointed out the same thing about Dick Cheney. He said that what he believed and what he observed as a member of the House of Representatives was a kind of a campaign led by Dick Cheney to convince George W. Bush that going into Iraq was a good idea. In other words, it seems to coincide with what you say, that the Dick Cheney factor was one of the strongest advocates here in going into Iraq.
Well, clearly it was. And another thing that happened in the summer of 2002, our staff meeting with Near East South Asia, folks getting together talking about things, the word scooter was passed around. We need to get this to Scooter. Scooter needs to get this faxed right away this afternoon. And I thought Scooter was a general. Oftentimes they have nicknames, and it turns out it was Scooter Libby, Dick Cheney's chief of staff. And we, at the level we were at the Pentagon, 3 layers below Rumsfeld, we would never have had direct dealings of that nature with Dick Cheney's office. But in fact, we did. And my boss at NESA, Near East South Asia, had been assigned over there from Dick Cheney's staff, where he had worked for Cheney before he came to the Pentagon. So this network of associates with an agenda, certainly Dick Cheney is a major part of that. But I would take issue with the fact that Dick Cheney had to work really hard to convince George W. Bush to do anything. I mean, George W. Bush was excited about an opportunity to show himself as a strong president. He thought I don't think he had any problem with going in and knocking off Saddam Hussein. I mean, this regardless of the tenuous link between 9/11, which certainly we know today, and we knew then that there was no link. I don't really want to say that Dick Cheney was calling all the shots here. The president may have been an easy mark, but he was very interested in pursuing this line of action. I don't think Cheney had to argue with him too much.
So let's go back to the talking points thing. So what you indicated was that when you were in NISA, in the Near East Southern Asia deployment, that you started receiving information which looked to be almost like a propaganda campaign directed first at you and the people you worked with, kind of as a preliminary to starting the propaganda campaign for the American people, or simultaneous?
Simultaneously, it was. And Near East South Asia was a single office. Over the summer of 2002, a lot of political appointees, 15 to 17 political appointees, and a few military people and some professional civilians were brought into our office as additional people. We were kind of hot desking it, I guess you could say, sharing space. And at the end of the summer, this group of new assignees, mostly political appointees, found their own space separate from our space. And at that point, we were told they would be moving out. We were very happy. They would be also report to the same guy we did, Bill Luty, who was the guy that worked in Dick Cheney's office before he came over to the Pentagon. And in their new spaces, both our office would continue to report to to Bill Luty. The Office of Special Plans was the name of the organization. It would report to Luty and would function as a sister organization. Now, these people in this organization, the decision makers and the propagandizers, for the most part, were political appointees. They were neoconservatives. We knew this because they shared space with us for 3 months, and so we did get to know them to some extent. Once they had separate space, there was a announcement made to all the people in the office, and it was told to us on the very first day of their entity getting its own space and forming its solidifying its function, so to speak. We were told that they would be producing all of the talking points on 3 subjects: Iraq, terrorism, and weapons of mass destruction. When we put together papers, which is what we did there, put together papers for the higher ups, policy papers, summaries of intelligence, that kind of thing. When we did that, if we had anything to say about Iraq, WMD, or terrorism, we would not say it by looking. We would not extract it from the intelligence. We would not review the latest stuff. We would simply place a phone call to the Office of Special Plans, and within a day or two, these talking points would be, and we were directed they would be included in their entirety without modification and no deletions. All of that would go into all of our papers that we were putting together, if we had anything to say about Iraq, terrorism, or WMD. So in this way, the language and the information was being controlled, very tightly controlled. We were happy as workers. We're government workers, okay? If somebody wants to do our job for us, we're very happy to let that happen, until you started, we looked at what they were saying and noticed that it was very propagandistic. It did not match the intelligence. There were leaps of faith made. There were assumptions made and presented as if they were true. That was being done to us within the Pentagon, and it was not just our office. These talking points were sent out to any office that was preparing information on these topics and producing it. It was all coming back to this one office. It was only later when I noticed that these same terms and phrases, these same false assumptions and outright lies in some cases, were being represented and repeated in the newspapers and on CNN and Fox and the various news outlets. So then it was clear that it wasn't just us that were being propagandized.
So let me back up.
This was a major operation of disinformation.
So we're talking 2002. I'm curious if you have any reason to believe, any evidence that there was actually a discussion of Iraq that predated 9/11. In other words, many have the theory that really there was the idea and the goal of going into Iraq. 9/11 created a convenient kind of a straw man argument to go in there, but that the plans predated 9/11. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, it's I don't have any particular knowledge that other people do not have. We had the Project for a New American Century, had long talked about and had advocated, I think, had pushed Clinton for many years to attack Iraq, to take out Saddam Hussein. In fact, in 1998, after the Monica Lewinsky scandal, we did, I forget the name of that operation, but we spent a week or so bombing Iraq. And this was something that was cheered by the neoconservatives at that time. This is long before George W. Bush is really anywhere close to being the president. There's an organization, a think tank, Institute for Policy Studies or something. I'm not sure. I don't have the name right because I didn't check it beforehand. But there was a document published under their logo, which was what was it called? A clean break. It was written by many of the same neoconservatives who later came to work for Rumsfeld in the Pentagon, who were part of the Bush security staff in a sense. And this clean break document was published late 80s, I think. I don't have an exact date. And it also centers around the necessity, not for the United States, but the necessity for Israel's own security, that Saddam Hussein and the country of Iraq be broken. Okay, and I don't mean maybe physically broken, and maybe I do mean physically broken. I mean that instead of one strong secular country, secular Arab country, what we would have would be smaller parts which were religiously in conflict and not secular. But because they're not secular, they are more manageable. And of course, if they're not secular, they have less sympathy globally. And so the idea with the clean break was not particularly about Iraq per se, but the needs of Israel in terms of its security environment. And it's just like if Mexico or Canada became very, very large and powerful in some way, whether it's economically or militarily, we might look for ways to weaken our powerful neighbors. That is what Israel was doing, or at least the people who wrote the clean break document, strategy for securing the realm. The realm that it was securing, of course, was Israel. It was written by American, probably dual passport holders in many cases, but it was written by Americans to kind of advise Israel. We have an interesting problem with Israeli policy. You know, there's that the Israelis would like to pursue, and then there's that the American advocates for Israel would like to pursue. And oftentimes it's not quite the same thing. But in any case, the neocons who wrote that all came together in many ways in the Bush administration. And so, yes, Iraq was always a target. I think the other public evidence that we all have, and I'm not particularly privy to it, is George Bush's own statements and writings after he left office, where and what people have written about his own other people's memoirs, where Bush Jr. or Bush 43 was very interested in maybe completing what his father had not done in some ways in 1991, and certainly he's being egged on a great deal by the neoconservatives who were lobbying Clinton as well to do this under Clinton's presidency. So the push to do something about Iraq, do something about Saddam Hussein, certainly had been around in both American Israel strategy circles, the neoconservatives, and George Bush, Bush 43, George W. Bush himself. So no secret that we had animosity and perhaps an intent to destroy Saddam Hussein. And there is no doubt, of course, that the events of 9/11, Rumsfeld's running around less than a day afterwards saying, dig up stuff on Iraq because this may be the opportunity. Well, the opportunity is for something that many people had been speaking of publicly for many years. So that's not really secret. That we would go as far as we did to lie and to falsify information that's put out to the American people, trying to link Saddam Hussein to 9/11 and trying to link Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda. Both of those linkages were fabricated. They did not exist. They logically would never have existed. Here we have Saddam Hussein as a secular person. He was enemy number 2 behind the United States of the al-Qaeda leader. So, because he was a bad Muslim and he wasn't, using his power and wealth to enhance, an Islamic republic of some sort. So in any case, none of this is secret. We use 9/11. We use 9/11 to do something that many people who happened to be in power at the time had wanted to do for a long, long time. They lied to the American people to do it, and then they did it.
We just have about a minute left, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, other than Iraq, when you look back at 9/11, what's your biggest concern, or what stands out most glaringly to you that was done under the guise of being a response to or logical sequence from 9/11? In other words, Patriot Act, surveillance and wiretapping type stuff, other Middle East policy. I mean, what comes up for you that's most concerning where 9/11 was used in a misinformation campaign?
Oh, my goodness. Well, you named a couple of them, but I think for me, given my focus to some extent on the overseas policy, military type stuff, I was very surprised that from the beginning, we intended to construct permanent military bases in Afghanistan, that we would really move forward in setting up a puppet leader who is still in place today, Hamid Karzai, and building military bases which are strategically located to secure and help secure pipelines. This sounds like a very economic, trade-oriented type of thing, and yet here we use 9/11 to occupy and build what we wanted to build in a permanent sense in Afghanistan. And I think, what we're hearing, 2024, we won't leave Afghanistan. And I think that was very much envisioned by the people that used 9/11 as a mechanism to get some of the militaristic foreign policies that they wanted. So that surprised me. I have to admit, I did not see the Patriot Act coming, and I think most of the people in Congress who voted for it did not see it coming. I know for a fact they did not read it. So, it's an ugly, ugly thing.
U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel retired Karen Kwiatkowski. Really a pleasure to speak with you, and thanks so much for doing this, especially on short notice.
Sure enough. Absolutely. Anytime.